Awesome. Well, I have to confess to you this morning, I pulled a mean trick on your pastor. He emailed me, not this past week, the week before, for information about this Sabbath. And that is the earliest I have ever been reached out to. A lot of times I don't get reached out to until Wednesday or Thursday when everyone's panicking for bulletin information. Your pastor was on the ball, and he wanted that information, and I sent him the information, and then did a wonderful pastor type thing, and changed my mind. And decided I wanted to share a different message with you this morning, and remembered last minute to send that information to pastor, but I think the bulletin had already been done, and so that is on me. So I am going to switch things up on you here this morning. But before I get into the sermon, I cannot come to a church and not spend a few minutes talking about education. Adventist education has made a huge difference in my life. I've spent my entire school career in Adventist education, save for 1 year in university, and that changed my mind to quickly go back to where I had come from. It was quite the experience for me, not a real positive one. And then I've spent my whole career working in Adventist education. And so I do want to take a few minutes and just give you a little spotlight about Adventist education, and more specifically Adventist education here in the Gulf States Conference. So just a little bit of information for you, and hopefully, there we go. So just a little bit of information about who we are. Our mission is to enable learners to develop a life of faith in God and to use the knowledge, skills, and understandings to serve God and humanity. That is the whole point. That is what Adventist education is all about. And in fact, if you think of Adventism and you think about the evangelistic tools that we have at our disposal, probably the two biggest ministries that we have at our disposal is the health message and education. Those were two of the founding pillars of what Seventh-day Adventism is all about. Our purpose: Adventist schools encourage students to learn and grow and explore their world, encircled by the safe boundaries of caring teachers, curated curriculum, and relevant activities for each developmental stage. And I don't know if you know this, but the Adventist system is the second largest parochial system in the world. We have nearly 7,500 schools in 150 countries, serving 1.5 million students throughout the world. We have 4 core values when it comes to Adventist education here in the Gulf States Conference. And we try to ensure that every decision that we make for our schools, for our students, are grounded in these 4 core values. The first one, that learners will choose to accept God as the Creator and the Redeemer. We obviously can't force anyone to make that decision, but everything we do is to try to make that decision possible. Number 2, that learners will grow in their knowledge and understanding of God's creation. Number 3, learners will creatively apply their spiritual, physical, intellectual, and social emotional knowledge. And number 4, learners will demonstrate their commitment to the Creator through service to others. And all of these pictures are pictures from our school, our schools, our students, as they learn, as they grow, as they share. So what do we offer? I'm not going to read everything to you, but what is it about Adventist schools that should have you interested? Well, first of all, we teach for eternity. That is why we're here, and that is what you are not going to get from a lot of other schools. We do prepare our students for higher education. Studies show that the longer that students are in the Adventist system, the more prepared they are for higher education. So some people kind of think, well, you spend all that time focusing on the spiritual dynamic, that academics must not be very good. And that simply isn't the case, and we have statistics to show that. and students are prepared for a life of students. All of our schools, whether they're elementary schools, high schools, or colleges, all of our schools involve our students in community service. As they get older, even some mission trips. I don't know if you heard, but Bass Memorial Academy last year went to Kenya. And they built a school building for students there in Kenya. What an experience that was for the kids. It changed their lives. There's no doubt about it. What is different about Adventist school? First of all, it's a balanced education. Not only are we focusing on reading, writing, and arithmetic, but we're also focusing on the spiritual aspect of children's lives. It is a safe environment. Just listen to what is going on nowadays in schools and what is being taught at some crazy ages, and the bullying and the violence and things that are happening. And hey, our Adventist schools are not perfect. The devil doesn't stay out of our schools just because they're an Adventist school. But it is a much safer development where you can be sure, or an environment where you can be sure that what is being taught meshes with what we believe. And it is a rigorous curriculum, but it is a rigorous curriculum blended in biblical truth. I can walk into any classroom and they'll be in the middle of math class, and the teacher will be bringing in a spiritual application to what they are learning, and that is always a piece of what is happening. Here are some facts. 85% of students that graduate from an Adventist school attend college. And the more years that a student attends an Adventist school, the more his or her performance improves. And I love this quote from the Real Education Reform, Take a Cue from the Adventists. This was published in the Christian Science Monitor. It says, a skeptic might argue that private schools such as those run by the Adventists are made up of primarily wealthy, white, upper middle class students, hence the reason for the higher achievement. Not so. Our research shows the demographics of Adventist schools are closer to those of public schools, with high economic and socioeconomic diversity. Enrollment is open, which means students are admitted without the kind of screening that many other private schools employ. Adventist schools' results challenge other private schools, but the difference is other private schools are very picky about who they will accept. You have to be strong academically before they'll even let you in the door. Adventist schools do not do that. If you are interested in what we have to offer, we want you to be there, strong academics or not. This is our Gulf States Conference ministry. We have 12 schools throughout the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, the panhandle of Florida. 10 of those schools are elementary schools, pre-kindergarten through grade 8. We do have a junior academy in Birmingham, Alabama, which is Hoover Christian School, that offers a program through grade 10. And then in partnership with Bass Memorial Academy, they actually offer grade 11 and 12. And it's one of the things that I love about our conference. A lot of times in other conferences, schools can be kind of competitive with one another. And instead, Bass Memorial Academy and Hoover Christian School have partnered together to allow Hoover to offer grade 11 and 12 program to their students, even though they're a junior academy. So that's such a blessing. And then, of course, like I said, we have our boarding academy in Mississippi, Bass Memorial Academy. If you've ever attended camp meeting at the end of the year in May, that is on the campus of Bass Memorial Academy there. I'm excited to tell you that our enrollment is growing. As far as the conferences in the Southern Union went, we had the third highest growth this year. And so that is exciting. Our schools are growing and the ministry is spreading. And so we're excited about that. So why should you consider Adventist education? If you are parents or grandparents, why Adventist education? Well, in the book Education, it reads, in the highest sense, the work of education and the work of redemption are one, for in education as in redemption, Other foundation can no man lay than that which has already been laid, which is Jesus Christ. She also writes, in this time of special danger for the young, temptations surround them on every hand. Doesn't that sound like today? And while it is easy to drift, the strongest effort is required in order to press against the current. Every school should be a city of refuge for the tempted youth, a place where their folly should be dealt with patiently and wisely. And lastly, teachers do a high and noble work by cooperating with the divine purpose in imparting to young people a knowledge of God and in molding the character in harmony with His. In awakening a desire to reach God's ideal, they present an education that is as high as heaven and as broad as the universe. This education cannot be completed in this life, but will be continued in the life to come. It is an education that secures to successful students a passport from the preparatory school of earth to the higher grade, the school above. Now, as a church, what should your focus be? Well, as a church, it's hard to focus on any one thing. But one thing you need to focus on is these lovely kids that you've got here this morning. That was fun watching them during children's story. In fact, studies have been done that point out that your church's number one priority should be your kids ages 5 to 12. And in the book, Transforming Children into Spiritual Champions, it reads, why focus on this particular slice of the youth market? Because if you want to shape a person's life, whether you are most concerned about his or her moral, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, or economic development, it is during these crucial 8 years that lifelong habits, values, beliefs, and attitudes are formed. And in fact, later on in the book, it goes on to say, the spiritual moorings of children are in place by the age of 9. So it becomes extremely important to provide our children with the opportunity to accept Jesus at a very young age. Further in that book, studies show that the probability of someone accepting Jesus into their lives, 32% ages 5 to 12, 4% ages 13 to 18, and 6% as adults. Yet we so often focus on the adults. And it's not that we shouldn't focus on the adults. Of course we should, but we can't forget the kids. That is where we have the highest probability of bringing someone to the foot of the cross to have an encounter with Jesus. In a study that the North American Division did, they asked students, what are the factors that helped you develop your religious faith? And these were the top 10 responses given by students. Number 1, attending an Adventist school. Mother's faith, school weeks of prayer, father's faith, grandparents' faith, conference summer camps, student weeks of prayer, Pathfinders, the Bible teacher, and school Bible classes. 5 of the top 10 reasons given are in relation to school. And that's not all that surprising when you think about it. Where do kids spend the most of their time? In school. And so if we can ensure that we are training them spiritually during that time, our odds of getting them to have an encounter with Jesus increase. A few last quotes for you. Why should this matter to you as a church? Ellen White writes, in all our churches and wherever there is a company of believers, church schools should be established. While we should put forth our earnest efforts for the masses of people around us and push the work into foreign fields, that's what our Sabbath school lesson is talking about, right? Mission. But no amount of labor in this line can excuse us for neglecting the education of our children and youth. We've got to take care of our families to be able to take care of everyone else. God has appointed the church as a watchman to have jealous care over the youth and children, and as a sentinel to see the approach of the enemy and give warning of danger. But the church does not realize the situation. She is sleeping on guard. Church, take care of your young people. Watch out for them. Guard them. This world has some pretty crazy stuff going on in it. Just listen to the news. Just listen to what's going on in schools. Just everything. We've got to take care of our young people. Fact. 75% of students at an Adventist school believe that they will go on to become active church members. 81% of all students say attendance at an Adventist school increased their personal faith. Here in the Gulf States Conference, we've got 12 schools, or as I like to refer to them, evangelistic centers. Somehow we take evangelism and schools and try to separate them. There's no separation. That's what our schools are, our evangelistic centers. Those numbers are okay, but they're not good enough. Those numbers need to be higher than that. So church leaders, pastors, elders, anybody in the church, look to the schools. Whether it's elementary schools, high schools, the colleges. Look to the schools to be places of evangelistic fields. Okay? Cultivate these fields, and you will see a rich reward. Last thing, what can you do? What can a church do to support Adventist education? I'd like to suggest the following. 1, pray for our students. Every single day, the devil is after them. And they need prayers to make wise decisions, to decide to give their life to Jesus. Pray for our students. Secondly, and no less important, pray for our teachers. It is a huge responsibility to have a group of students that you are trying to lead to the foot of the cross, and to try to teach and try to help them with everything that's going on in their lives. Pray for our teachers. If you have elementary schools or junior academies in your area, and I believe for you guys the closest school would probably be Big Cove up in Huntsville. Support them any way you can. Hard for you because the distance, I suspect, I haven't Google mapped it, but I'm guessing you're probably about an hour plus away from Huntsville, give or take. Sorry? Okay, half hour from here? Okay. All right. So support it. Actually, Big Cove Christian Academy in Huntsville is probably one of our fastest growing schools in this conference. They've got a fantastic program going on there. Recruit students to attend, volunteer, help with funding. I don't know if you've heard, but we have started an elementary endowment here in the Gulf States Conference. And our goal, and I know it sounds massive, our goal is to raise $10 million for elementary education. And I know a lot of people go, yeah, okay, $10 million, where are you going to get that? Well, 4 years ago, we started an endowment for Bass Memorial Academy with a goal of $10 million. And here in the Little Gulf States Conference, in 4 years, we have crossed the $6 million mark in 4 years. So we can do this. And that can help increasing costs and make Adventist education available to anyone who wants it. If you do not have an elementary school or junior academy in your area, I'm here. Talk to me. I would love to help with that. We have a process developed for how to get a school started. If there is a community that is interested in starting a school, let's pull up our sleeves and get to work. And last but not least, if you can, support Bass Memorial Academy. I was the principal there for 6 years. And I can tell you what a blessing it is. Every so often I would go to my mailbox and I would pull out a letter. And in that letter, inside was a letter from a church member somewhere who just sent in a check. Sometimes it was $20. Sometimes it was a couple $100. Put this towards a student who needs it, please. And some of those donations made it so that families who couldn't afford were able to attend. It allows us to create what we call our Worthy Student Fund there, to try to provide extra funding to families who need it. So that's just a little bit about Adventist education here in the Gulf States Conference. I'm trying to reel myself in because once I get talking about it, we could be here all afternoon. It's something that I tend to be a little bit passionate about, but I think there's good reason for that. There is nothing more important in our church than our kids. And we've got to take care of them. All right, now because I have shared that with you, I promise my sermon isn't an hour long. We've reeled that in here a little bit. But I do want to share with you probably one of my favorite stories in the Bible. But before we get into that, let me tell you a story before we get into the story from the Bible. And this story centers around a fitness center. And the owner of this fitness center was a big, strong bodybuilder. And he used to have this deal that if anybody could come into his fitness center and prove that they were stronger than he was, he would give them $1,000. And so here is how it would work. People would sign up for this challenge with the owner. And the owner would go, and he would get a glass, and he would get a lemon. And he would cut the lemon in half, and then he would take half of a lemon, and he would squeeze it until all the juice poured out into the glass, until there wasn't another drop that he could get out. And then he would hand it to the challenger. And if anybody could get even one more drop of juice out of that lemon after he was done, they would get the $1,000. People would come from near and far to try to get a drop of juice out of the lemon, and no one succeeded. Construction workers, wrestlers, nobody ever won this challenge. Well, one day they were talking, and this short, skinny, kind of scrawny guy comes walking in, and he signs up for the challenge. Well, everybody who's watching is laughing, and why are you even bothering wasting your time? But the owner decides to give him a chance, so he goes out, he grabs that lemon, he squeezes it into the glass, and then he hands it to the challenger. And he wraps his hand around that lemon, and he squeezes, and 6 more drops of juice come out of the lemon. And the owner and everybody's just silence. Can't believe it. And so the owner gives him his $1,000, and the man thanks him and starts to head out of the fitness center. And the owner calls after him and he says, I don't understand how you did that. What are you? Are you a bodybuilder? Are you a construction worker? What is it that you do? And as the man was walking out the door, he looked over his shoulder and said, no, I'm none of those things. I work for the IRS. Our story this morning, as I mentioned, has become one of my favorites in the Bible. And it has many lessons, I believe, to teach us about our calling as Christians. And I also believe that there are some parallels that can be drawn from this story into Adventist education. So our story this morning is found in Luke 19. And I'm going to start with verses 1 and 2. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. Now you understand why I told you a story about the IRS. Who was the chief collector, and he was rich. So our story this morning talks about a tax collector. But understand something about Zacchaeus. He was liked even less than the IRS is liked. This guy was despised. Not only was he a tax collector, it says he was a chief tax collector. And so what that means is he had bought the rights from Rome to collect taxes in that part of Jericho. And he was allowed to add his cut. And he was doing it. Let's say the required taxes for Rome were 5%. So what Zacchaeus would do is he would add another 5% and keep his cut. And Jericho was a great place to collect taxes because people were coming in and out of the city on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover. The Jews considered Zacchaeus to be a traitor. Rome hated him because he was a Jew. But they tolerated him because he was obviously good at his job. Because again, in verse 2, what does it say? It said he was rich. If he was rich, he was doing a good job getting his cut. And it also means Rome was getting their full payment. But Zacchaeus couldn't afford to take his cut until Rome got what belonged to them. Otherwise, he would have been in big trouble. So with that background, knowing that about Zacchaeus, I want to suggest to you 3 things this morning about who Zacchaeus was, and then I'll follow that up with 3 things that Zacchaeus found out that day that I believe we can offer to people today if we're willing to accept the mission, the calling. So the first thing that I would like to suggest to you is that Zacchaeus was lonely. And if you read verse 3, it says, "And he sought to see who Jesus was, but he could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature." Verse 3 tells us that Zacchaeus was trying to find out who Jesus was. It doesn't say that he just wanted to see Jesus, which sometimes when we tell the story, that's the part we focus on. It's not that he just wanted to see Jesus. He wanted to know who Jesus was. What made Jesus so different? If Zacchaeus was perfectly content, if he was happy with his riches and his home life, do you think he'd have gone through all the trouble of climbing a tree? In verse 4, "So he ran ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way." I think that Zacchaeus wasn't just curious to see Jesus. I think he was desperate to see Jesus. Why? Because he ran. Desperate people run. And he climbed a tree. How many of you in the last couple of months have climbed a tree? A lot of the kids' hands are going up. Adults? Most adults don't climb trees unless you're trying to escape from a lion or a flood. What? Logs. Most adults don't climb trees unless they are looking for a way out of something. So, the second thing that we know about Zacchaeus then is he was looking. And the context of these verses, if you read them carefully, suggests that Zacchaeus was looking intensely. He wanted something. I think he knew that something was missing in his life, so he got resourceful. He ran ahead of the crowd and climbed up into a tree. He didn't allow the crowd or his short stature to keep him from seeing Jesus. But even though Zacchaeus was looking, he was lost. Now let me suggest something to you this morning that maybe you haven't considered before. Zacchaeus was very resourceful in getting to see Jesus. But in his desperation, he actually ended up being further from Jesus. You see, when the crowd goes by, Jesus is in the crowd. and he'll see Jesus, but he won't be able to get to him because he's way up in a tree. So let's take a moment and apply that to our lives. Look at the world around you. People are lost. The world is lost. And in their very attempt to find their way to the source of whatever they believe may be their salvation, they'll no doubt get themselves further from where they need to be. Why? Because they're lost. And things and people who are lost can't find themselves. They have to be found. When I was about 10 years old, my father and I and another family went on a hike to a place called the Seton Hiking Trail. And there is a section of this trail. The trail is about 10 miles long. It's through the woods. And there is a section of this trail about a mile long where the trail splits into two parts and then comes back together again. So being 10 years old and thinking that I was bigger and wiser than I probably was, my friend and I suggested to our parents that, hey, the path meets up in a mile. Let us go our way and have some fun. You go your way, have some fun, and we'll meet up at the end. Surprisingly, our parents agreed to our plan. And off we went, and we were having the time of our lives. We were skipping rocks in the lake and running around and doing who knows what, climbing trees and just having a blast. Anyways, we continued on down to the end of the path. And to this day, I'm not really sure what happened. But when we got there, the adults weren't there. We waited around, but somehow we didn't meet up. We started running all over the place trying to find the adults. And I knew we were lost. Everything in me wanted to find the adults and not be lost anymore. But I couldn't find my way out. I was lost. I had to be found. This was in the day and age where there were no cell phones, so we couldn't call the adults. We were lost. And folks, that is how it is with the world around us. There are a lot of people who are lost. And you might be the one who has to get going and reach those people. They're not going to find themselves. When we're lost, somebody's got to go and find us. And that's where my dad came in. He took the other adults back to the car in case we found our way back somehow on our own. And then he started running that trail, 10-mile trail, looking for us. He ran for about 8 hours that day. But he wasn't going to stop until we were found. He didn't just go sit in the car and wait for us to find our way back. He didn't worry about how tired he was or all the other things he had planned to do that day. He only had one thing on his mind. He would do everything in his power to ensure that we would be found and we would be safe. So I'd like to suggest to you this morning that those of us who have our spiritual legs under us need to stop worrying so much about other things and get out there and go find some lost people. Now, there are 3 things I told you about who Zacchaeus was. He was lonely, he was looking, and he was lost. Now, here's 3 things that I want you to notice about what happened to Zacchaeus that day. And again, what we talked about at the beginning, don't forget, he's about the worst kind of sinner in the eyes of the religious people. He's the lowest of the low. But the first thing that happened to Zacchaeus that day was that he found support. When Zacchaeus ran ahead of the crowd, he went to a tree. The tree held him up. The tree lifted him above the crowd. So here's my question. Are you willing to be a tree? to lift people up so they can see Jesus. What would have happened to Zacchaeus that day if the tree hadn't been there? We'll never know. I like to believe that we'll never know because Jesus made sure that that tree was right where it needed to be. And folks, Jesus is planting you right in front of some people that need to be lifted up. It might be a family member, a student, someone you work with. Maybe it's the person you're sitting beside right now. But Jesus is planting us in front of people that need to be lifted up. The second thing that Zacchaeus found that day was he found safety. Look what verse 5 says. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked at him and said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Jesus called him by name. Doesn't it make you more comfortable when someone addresses you by name? The first word that Jesus spoke to Zacchaeus was his name. Now let's think about this for a minute. I bet you Zacchaeus had been called a lot of names. But at the tree, Jesus didn't say, Zacchaeus, you're a thief. Now repent and pay back to all the poor people that you stole from the money that you took. You see, Jesus doesn't do that. If he did, none of us, not one of us, would meet the mark. No, what he said was, hey, Zacchaeus, come on down out of that tree. Let's go to your house and get to know each other. Because once you get to know me, you're going to want to be like me. And I believe that Zacchaeus felt safe in Jesus' presence and with Jesus' request. You see, in those days, to invite someone to your house meant you accepted them. They were your friend. And so verse 6 reads, so he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. Zacchaeus hurried and came down and welcomed Jesus. Zacchaeus didn't waste any time getting out of that tree. The word gladly or joyfully in the original text carries with it the idea of being overwhelmed with joy. See, Zacchaeus wanted to get a closer look to find out who Jesus was. Jesus saw beyond who Zacchaeus was and knew what Zacchaeus needed. And without any coaxing on anyone's part, Zacchaeus became all that he was meant to be in Jesus. Why? Because Jesus gave Zacchaeus more than he expected. Jesus brought salvation to Zacchaeus' house that day. In verse 9 and 10 it reads, and Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he also is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. And Jesus will always do that for you and for me. If we simply look for Jesus, he will always give us more than what we could think or ask for. He'll overwhelm us with joy, and he'll bring us salvation. Now let me ask you a question. When people watch you, when your friends or family or co-workers or teenagers, when they see you, do they see a person who is overwhelmed with joy because of their relationship with Jesus? I believe I have an awesome job. Being an Adventist educator is an awesome responsibility. You've already heard me say I believe that Adventist education is one of the greatest evangelistic tools that this church has to offer. And at our Gulf States Conference schools, we have many goals. that need to be accomplished, preparing students for the next step in their educational journey, helping students grow socially and physically, to name a couple. But our overarching goal, our mission, is to lead these young people who are at our schools to Christ. Most of them will be in desperate need of support. They need a tree to lift them up so they can see Jesus. Most of them will be in desperate need of safety. They need to feel accepted and safe so they can turn their attention to understanding who Jesus is and what he means in their lives. And we want all of them to find salvation. While we can't choose salvation for them, we can put as many trees as possible in their path to give them every opportunity to have an encounter with Christ. Shouldn't your church have these same goals for your members, for the visitors of your church? In his book, The Called, The Chosen, Ken McFarland states the following: "And when God's people witness, when they share their faith, they are far more than just proclaimers. As any good writing teacher emphasizes, showing trumps telling any day. Spirit-driven witnessing is far more than sharing information, though it can certainly include that. The primary witness of God's people, however, is not just what others hear them say, but what others see them live." That last sentence just struck me. I think it's huge. The primary witness of God's people, however, is not just what others hear them say, but what others see them live. It reminds me of that old saying, preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. So, every year in our Gulf States Conference schools, we challenge our teachers with these four following things. And again, I would encourage you as a church to consider challenging yourselves as well. Number one, to be the support, the tree that our students need. To make them feel safe and accepted in their school. To put as many trees in their path as possible so they can have that encounter with Jesus. And to witness to them. Not only in the things we say, but in how we deal with them on a day-to-day basis. You guys have a good thing going. I can tell you, as Catherine and I travel around a lot, this was a pretty awesome welcome we got here this morning. Walking in, everyone coming up and taking the time to welcome us, that is awesome. That's in how you do it, right? It's what you do, not what you say, and that is so important. So I'd like to leave you with this morning. There is a large work still left to be done in order to prepare this world for Christ's return. It's the goal of Adventist education to provide students with the necessary tools so they can go and finish that work. Won't you as a church join in that effort? In Matthew 9:37 and 38 it says, "Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest truly is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest.'"